Okay, picture the human mind for a second. Is it a product of ancient spiritual forces, or is it a ridiculously complex web of modern brain science? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the fascinating and honestly, sometimes pretty tense intersection of faith and psychology. We're going to unpack exactly how different thinkers map the human mind, how they define our deepest struggles, and ultimately, how they think we can actually heal.
It really all boils down to one massive question. And this sets the stakes for how we understand human struggle. Is our suffering a sickness of the brain, or is it a sickness of the soul? For decades now, a huge debate has raged between theologians and psychologists over this. And how you answer this single question, well, it completely changes the kind of help you end up seeking out.
Here is our roadmap for This Explainer. We're going to define the soul and psyche, explore the biblical counseling movement, pivot to the integrationist approach, see what happens when neuroscience enters the dance, and finally, look at healing the whole person.
All right, part one, defining soul and psyche. Ancient words, modern meanings. Let's lay some groundwork.
You know what's really fascinating? Long before clinical psychology even had a name, ancient texts were actively diagnosing the human condition. The Bible itself serves as an incredibly early psychological text. In fact, the literal word psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, which translates directly to soul. Early thinkers didn't separate the clinical mind from the spiritual soul. To them, it was just one unified inner agent experiencing life, facing loss, and looking for meaning.
So this gives us the baseline of biblical psychology. It's called the tripartite nature of man, and it basically breaks the human condition into three distinct but totally overlapping parts. You've got the body, which handles biological life. You have the soul, which is the seat of self-consciousness. That's where your emotions and your will live. And then you have the spirit, viewed as the organ of God consciousness. Getting this blueprint down is absolutely crucial because it's the exact framework strict biblical counselors use to diagnose behavior today. Moving right along to part two, the biblical counseling movement, the Compen approach.
So this is where the battle lines are really drawn. Biblical counselors operate on what's called the Compen premise. That stands for comprehensive internal. They firmly believe that the Christian faith already contains all the comprehensive internal resources you could ever need to understand personality and change. You literally don't need to look outside the text. On the flip side, you have integrationists who lean towards VI texts, meaning they believe secular psychology actually provides a vital external contribution to soul care.
Now, for the strict biblical camp, human problems go way, way deeper than just bad habits or secular labels like having low self-esteem. They argue that modern culture has basically taken deeply spiritual problems and just slapped clinical labels onto them. From their viewpoint, the human heart, meaning our thoughts, our desires, our will, that is the undeniable root of all our behavior. This perspective heavily critiques secular psychology, arguing that it only treats the symptoms. It's kind of like prescribing a painkiller for a deep spiritual sickness. Through this biblical counseling lens, sin isn't just doing bad things. It's a systemic distortion of how a person thinks. They completely reject secular models as spiritually blind. But, and this is important, they don't just ignore emotions. Actually, they treat emotions like incredibly vital alarm bells that expose the true hidden state of someone's heart. Which brings us to part three, the integrationist approach, bringing science to the soul. Let's look at the other side of the coin. What happens when practitioners actually believe that clinical science and ancient faith can and honestly should work hand in hand? Well, you get the evangelical psychotherapy movement. These folks are actively integrating clinical therapies, think cognitive behavioral methods, right alongside their faith. They don't see empirical research as a threat. Instead, they view it as a deeply complementary tool, mixing the hard clinical rigors of modern psychology with the theological care of the soul. Integrationists make the case that God's common grace extends into secular disciplines too. So Christian psychology supplements scripture with clinical insights to help untangle really complex issues, things like severe emotional disorders or past relational trauma. What's super interesting here is that this movement often sees itself as an incarnation of grace. They try to step in and offer psychological empathy in places where, quite frankly, traditional church counseling might have come across as a little too harsh or legalistic.
All right, part four, neuroscience enters the dance, the neurotheology framing. Because as medical imaging gets better and brain science advances, everybody has to face the physical realities of the human brain. Enter the neurotheology framing. Thinker Everett Worthington brings up this relational model.
arguing that science can actually validate scriptural principles. In this view, careful scientific observations aren't just some optional external add-on. They literally force theologians to refine their interpretations of Scripture, acknowledging just how deeply physical human life really is. Worthington puts it perfectly. For me, the neurosciences and Scripture have danced over the years, and they continue to do so. I absolutely love that metaphor. Though, let's be real, when two entirely distinct disciplines try to dance, they're definitely going to step on each other's toes. But it's a dynamic, back-and-forth relationship. Scripture might lead the dance, but science follows incredibly closely, raising some tough questions about what it means to have a physical brain that sometimes just breaks down.
Here's a massive theological curveball for you. For the longest time, a lot of 19th century thinkers just assumed language was the absolute essence of being created in the image of God. But then modern medical science comes along and shows that stroke victims can experience aphasia, which is the total loss of language, while still clearly remaining 100% human. Science literally forced a huge reevaluation of a deeply held religious assumption.
And this right here perfectly captures the neurotheology framing. It's all about untangling the physical weaknesses of the brain from the moral failings of the soul. This is where the rubber meets the road. If someone has wild mood swings, is that a biological weakness, or is it the spiritual sin of anger? If you have a terrible memory for faces, is that just a glitch in your neurology, or does it mean you have a moral indifference toward other people? Neurotheology tries to carefully tease apart what needs a doctor from what needs a pastor.
But hold on, because the strict biblical camp has a pretty major critique here. Science constantly changes. For instance, about a decade ago, researchers confidently claimed they'd found a definitive bipolar gene. Today, that claim is viewed as highly, highly speculative. Because psychological research shifts so much and studies often fail to replicate, biblical counselors strongly warn against tying eternal theology to the constantly shifting sands of scientific consensus.
Finally, let's jump into part 5, healing the whole person.
Because despite all the friction and sharp disagreements we just talked about, both camps are actually aiming for the exact same ultimate goal: complete, holistic healing. They both want comprehensive renewal. That means renewing the heart, our cognitive and emotional processes. It means renewing our individual behavior and manner of life. It scales all the way up to renewing our communities. And, critically, it acknowledges the renewal of the physical body. Whether they're using ancient scripture, modern clinical psychology, or some kind of dance between the two, the end game is total human flourishing.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to ponder. How does your own understanding of the mind shape the way you seek out healing? When you're facing those deep internal struggles, do you view them strictly through the lens of brain chemistry, or do you see them as matters of the soul? Or maybe, is it a complex dance of both? Thanks so much for joining me as we decoded this fascinating intersection of science and the soul. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.